Chapter 2 this morning. Last week we looked at work, and this week I wanted to look at rest. Amen. Who needs this sermon this morning? No resting during this sermon. You have to stay awake. That's why we supply coffee for you out there in the foyer, right? But we're looking at Genesis chapter 2, and we have seen God has made the whole world. He has done that work in 7 days, and then given us a pattern. We see in verse 1, it says, "Thus the heavens and earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from all his work which God had created and made." So we notice a few things about this day that God creates of rest. He doesn't create anything on the seventh day, right? We don't have, say, evening and morning. We don't have God looking at anything, speaking it into existence, and then saying it is good. We just have him resting at this point. Now it says a few things about this. In verse 3, he blessed the seventh day and he sanctified it, or to make something holy, to set it apart, to mean it's different from some of the others. Because in it he had rested from all the work that he had created and made. So God rests at this point, but we have to define, what does it mean for God to rest? I think when I heard some amens, when I said we're going to talk about rest today, I imagine that comes from some of us who are tired, right? Who working just tuckers us out. But when God rests, does he rest because he's tired? No, we understand that. Psalm 121 tells us that God neither slumbers nor sleeps. He doesn't need to sleep. So we have to understand, what does it mean to say that God rested? Well, you've probably heard this before, but God rested, which means he ceased from work, not that he was tired. So God rests because he ceased from work. That's what goes in your first blank. Ezra, if you could advance that slide, it just needs a kickstart. So God ceased from his work, and that does not mean he was tired. There's a lot of wordplay going on here because God rested. That's the word Shabbat in Hebrew. To this day, the Jewish people recognize Shabbat. That's where we get the word Sabbath from. Okay? So God rested on the Shavi day, and that's 7. So Shabbat, Shavi, it sounds alike in Hebrew. So Moses is kind of bringing out that pun so that you make all these connections. And if you think that's interesting, we're going to show you a ton more of this kind of stuff today. So God rests on the seventh day. Now notice within this that when God ceases from his work, he then, what does he do? Verse 3, God blessed it, sanctified it, because he had rested. You don't find a command here that creatures must follow this Sabbath. What you find is a blessing. And that's important because we have to understand, when we look at our God, he is not just this divine rule maker. And we as Christians are here to divinely enforce rules. Sometimes fundamental Baptists get that kind of reputation that they are rule keepers, right? Well, God, although, yes, I understand, he gave the 10 Commandments, he didn't start out everything with rules. He started it with blessing, right? And the same thing even happened in the Garden of Eden, because you might say, well, God gave a rule right from the beginning, right? He said, you may not eat of this tree. But what you're missing there is God, right before that, gave a blessing and said, you may freely eat freely treat yourself, eat of every tree in the garden, only of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you may not eat, for in that day you eat of it you shall surely die. Okay. So God doesn't start with commands, he starts with abundance and blessing. And one thing I've been trying to do is try to think of something every day while I'm out praying, of something I can adore God for. And my Adoration Tuesday, I believe, because I'm thinking about it in terms of where I was walking. I walk all over the city. But my Adoration Tuesday was God is a God of abundance. He is not a stingy God. He's a God that blesses. And what blessing means is piling on more than what you need over and over. The very first thing he said to mankind was he blessed them and said, be fruitful and what? Multiply. God is a God of multiplication. See, he is a God that has always dwelt in three persons, yet one God, but there was a multiplicity of people. And he did not create mankind because he was lonely. He didn't create mankind to do his bidding, as we see the other ancient Near Eastern gods did last week. He created mankind to create an abundance of people enjoying each other and enjoying him, and he enjoying them. God is a God of abundance, and the Sabbath is something that is about abundance, not about putting yourself into strictures and giving yourself rules that you must obey. You find within Judaism today that they have just added on top of the commandment to remember the Sabbath, they have added all these levels so that you're never breaking the Sabbath, right? There's commands about not even lighting something, so they won't turn on a light switch because that would be lighting something on the Sabbath. There are commands in the Talmud that speak of you can't go out on a journey on the Sabbath. So in their minds, they think of, what would a journey be? Well, that would be if I were to throw a ball, that ball would be journeying. So you can't just throw a ball. Now, if the ball's caught, it's not a journey. It's just an exchange from one to the other. So you can play catch on the Sabbath, but you better be a good catch, because if you miss it, now you've journeyed. Okay? Now, the thing is, it doesn't help them obey the Sabbath any better. Also within the Sabbath is the idea of you don't make a journey outside of your house. So you know what people do within Judaism, and you could see this in the early 1900s in Brooklyn, where there were more Jewish people there than lived in Israel. They do a couple of things. They go the day before Sabbath and take a piece of furniture from their house and, walk wherever they'd want to walk. Go put their chair next to Macy's so that they can go there on the Sabbath. And say, well, that's my household. It's however many miles away over the Brooklyn Bridge, but that's my household because the chair's there. Or they would also set up strings going from their house and extend it through the whole neighborhood or wherever you wanted to go, and that was the boundary of your household. So you can just go wherever you'd like. And so this idea of just constricting yourself and looking at God's laws as restrictions does nothing to actually help your spirituality if you don't catch first the blessing that God gives with these things he gives to you. So when I preach on rest today, I'm not preaching to guilt you into resting. So wives, no slapping your husband saying, see, stop being a workaholic, pastor's giving you a rule. I'm not giving you a rule. I'm giving you a blessing because that's what God gives to us. And we understand when we grab hold of blessings, we gain them. And if we don't, we miss the blessing. We don't always get punished, but we don't get the blessing. So I want to help us today think about the blessing that is the Sabbath. So you can probably guess in your next slide there, God starts with blessing, not laws. Do you realize it takes all the rest of Genesis and then 20 chapters into Exodus, so about 60 or so chapters before you get an actual law on the Sabbath? That's a lot of ink in between time. So if God wanted to emphasize to you right at the top that you must keep the seventh day religiously, he would have put it here. If you ask me, well, then why did the law come later? Galatians gives us a little clue into that. Galatians says law was added because of transgression. Okay? Do you realize God gave principles, and if Israel had just lived by those, they would have experienced blessing, the blessing that God had given, and God wouldn't need to make more rules. Why do you make rules in a household? Because people are not living the way they ought to. And the more things people come up with, the larger the law code ends up being, right? I mean, look at some of our laws. You're like, where did that law come from? Well, it came from someone doing something stupid, probably. Something that was detrimental to themselves and humanity. So we create laws. But laws are created because of transgression. So God gives the law to Israel because of them not obeying just these blessings that he had started humanity with. So God starts with blessings, not laws. So now I want to talk about how God expresses this emphasis on 7 and Sabbath and resting. To me, this is interesting. If you like numbers, or if you like just interesting patterns. So this is the pattern of 7 in Genesis. And this is not something I discovered all on my own. This is not something that I came up with. I get it out of Umberto Cassuto, who is a Jewish scholar, wrote a Genesis commentary years ago in the early 1900s. But he points this out, and many others have discovered this as well. So let me show you how awesome Moses was at filling the book of Genesis with the pattern of 7, so that you get the idea 7 days you work, or 6 days you work, on the 7th you rest. 7 days. There's a week is 7 days. You know, I was hearing some people talk about the Sabbath. I was listening to a lecture on this, and they said, we don't know where the Jewish people came up with this idea of 7 and why whoever the author of Genesis was, now I believe it was Moses, why they chose 7 to be something special. I think, well, here's why they chose it, because God made the world in 7 days. That's why. That is what established what a week is. Now, yes, there are other cultures that have a 10-day week. There are other cultures that do things like this, but God made the world in 7 days. That's where this came from. It didn't come out of some pre-Israelite practice that was perhaps handed them by Babylonians. That's what a lot of scriptural scholarship tries to do. What is the source of this? Well, we believe the source is God revealing himself to humanity. So let me show you how Moses reveals to you the importance of the 7 days. Flip a page back in your Bibles to Genesis 1. Genesis 1 was written in Hebrew by Moses originally. And verse 1 of Genesis 1, my kids should be able to say it because we memorized it at camp one year, but memorized it in Hebrew. But the very first verse says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Yeah, and in the English it's 10 words. In Hebrew, verse 1 is 7 words. You might say, well, that's not that significant, Pastor. I got to tell you, Moses inserts 7 everywhere that he can to emphasize to you 7. The very first words of any book of the Bible are always the kind of most important, giving you the thesis to the rest of the book. So Moses chooses to start the first sentence with 7, so that right away you're starting out this concept of 7 being important. So the very first verse of Genesis contains 7 words in Hebrew. And here's why I know it's important. Verse 2, if you could guess how many words verse 2 would have, what would you guess? You might say 7, and that's close enough. It's double, because it's verse 2. Guess how many words that has? That has 14 words, okay? And our friend Umberto Cazzuto said there's too much of this for this to be coincidence, right? Now, this is not the Bible code. You know, there's all kinds of videos on YouTube where you can find weird stuff like this. This is just right there in the Hebrew text, and it has been observed for years. And in fact, when Hebrew people read the Bible, those who know the Bible well are called, we translate it scribes, but that literal word is they are the sepharim, they're the counters. They count, okay? That's how they guaranteed accuracy when they were making new copies of the Bible. They would count and make sure they had the exact number of words that were in the last copy. So early scribes counted. So they would be counting Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, and they would notice 7 and then 14, okay? So I assure you this stuff is on purpose. Moses knew this. The longest book of the Bible that has the most words, because scribes counted it, is Jeremiah. The book of the Bible with the most letters is Ezekiel. And we know this because scribes count things. And I only know this because I had a teacher whose dissertation was on Jeremiah, and he said, I don't know why I picked the longest book in the Bible. And he also, my weak spot in all of Scripture is Jeremiah, because he was so tired of it because he was working on his dissertation. He's like, yeah, here's Jeremiah. You know, he just kind of threw it at us. He was tired of all the counting. So verse 1 has 7, verse 2 has 14. So it's pointing you, God is making the heavens and the earth, and does it with these 7 words here. Okay? Now, here's something else that I think is kind of cool. The key words of verse 1 are found in multiples of 7 throughout chapter 1. And God knew through Moses, and Moses knew, because Moses knows the practice of scribes, that they would be counting this stuff. Okay? The word God occurs 35 times. So in the beginning, God, or the Hebrew word Elohim. Elohim occurs 35 times. That's a multiple of 7, right? The word, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That word earth, which is the same word land, Hebrew word aretz, that is found 21 times. And the word that we translate heavens, which also means the sky. So the land and the sky, in the beginning, God created the land and the sky. The word heavens is used 21 times. Okay? So Moses is piling all this 7 right at the top so that you see 7 is the key. Okay? Now there are many other things I could show you throughout Genesis 1, many other 7s. I'm only showing you this much, okay? I assure you I can show you a ton more if you'd like. They don't always come to my mind right away. I have to look them up sometimes. But so we have this 7 all over the place, because if you learn one thing from the Bible, you learn that God shows you at the top of his book how to read the rest of his book. Right? Now this is cool as well. What's neat about 7 is that it has like this perfect symmetry, right? Of 3s on both sides with 1 in the middle. And that really is a Jewish way of thinking. I can't spend a ton of time showing you this today, but throughout Jewish writing, you'll have, especially in poetry, you'll have words that match, like on line 1 and line 7, and then line 2 and line 6, and then line 3 and line 5, and then you'll have the important part will be line 4. That will give you the key to the whole rest of the chapter. Proverbs 31 works that way. It's a certain Hebrew way of thinking. Well, in verse 1, the very middle verse, and I think this is on purpose as well because Jesus kind of talks about this in Revelation. The very middle word is a word that has consists of 2 letters, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And do you remember, is there any time Jesus called himself by the first and last letter? Now, he did it in the New Testament, so he is the Alpha and Omega. He says that in Revelation. Well, here in Genesis, the very middle of the very first verse, the very first 7, you have a word that has the very first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is Aleph, sounds like alpha, and the very last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is a Tau, it's a T, basically. So they have A through T in Hebrew. So that just, again, is just focusing on this, okay, 7 is complete. All right, I'm going to do a complete work in 7. I'm going to have the beginning, I'm going to have the middle, I'm going to have the end. That's why he puts this word in the middle of it that has the first and last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In the middle of a verse that has 7 numbers, that is the complete number because God does a complete work in 7 days. So Moses just piles all this stuff on top of that. So that you understand the importance of 7. Now, the middle day of the week within Genesis chapter 1, day 4, what is created on that day? Verse 14, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens. And what is the purpose of the lights in the middle of the week? To divide day from night, let them be for signs, seasons, for days and years. So God takes the middle of 7 and shows you, here's what I'm doing with this 7. I am giving you something to measure life by. I'm giving you a rhythm to follow. All right? I'm giving you something that will be for signs and seasons. Now, season is not the word we think of when we think like spring, summer, fall. My favorite season is going on right now. Season in Hebrew is more about appointed seasons. So it'd be more like the idea of holidays, right? You live your life by these high points in the year. For Judaism, they had 7 high holy days, 7 Sabbaths throughout the year where they would make pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. You know, in the United States, we have certain signpost dates throughout the year. For me, I always enjoyed this time of year. From the time I had children, so pretty much my whole adult life, I always enjoyed September until Christmas because we had these things happen every year, and we did them at the same time. And we've kind of upset this pattern now, so we don't have the same rhythm. But let me just share with you the rhythm I used to love. So you get to the end of summer, and I'm glad because it's not hot anymore, because I'm not big on summer, I'm sorry. Fall is my favorite time. It's pretty and it's cool. I can wear clothes and not sweat constantly. So September comes along, and since we homeschool, we can do school whenever we want. So we would always take the first week of September off once everyone was going back. So I always found that fun, that we're still enjoying vacation time while everyone's back to the grind. The start of that would always be the state fair. I always loved the state fair. We would do it a week in September. And then after that, we would have these fall festivals. The first one would be my brother's work had a fall festival, and family was allowed to come. And we'd have apple cider and hay rides and all of that, because fall is not about pumpkins, it's about apples. That's my opinion. Okay, you can take your pumpkin spice, give me cider, and cider donuts especially. So we do these hay rides, fall festival. After that would be at a camp we used to go to, Camp Bayuka. There would be a father-son retreat every year in October. And it was just at peak leaf season, and we're out there shooting guns with men and eating Cornell recipe chicken and enjoying the leaves. And so that fall festival in October would come. And then after that is Thanksgiving. And for the past decade or so, my brother always came to our house and we celebrated it together. And I've told some of you we do Thanksgiving a little different. We make all kinds of unhealthy fried food on Thanksgiving. And then from Thanksgiving, you go into the Christmas season, and that's always fun and has all that activities. Well, these are rhythms of life that I enjoyed them coming every year. Oh, and then after Thanksgiving, there was the tree lighting ceremony in Rome, New York, and that was really special. My brother always came for that too. And every time we do that, at the end, we'd go home and drink hot cocoa. It was just our tradition, you know. So you have in your life these traditions, these seasons that are built in. Well, that's what this is speaking of, seasons. That the moon, the stars, the sun is there to give you a pattern for life, to look at time, to look at the beginning and to look at the end and to look at the middle. Something that you work for, that you work through. You find this word used throughout the rest of the Torah. That's the first 5 books of Moses. But you find throughout the rest of the Torah that God marks times in 7 to create cycles of freeing people. So that's what God's about doing. He's about freeing people on the 7th day. So within this passage, we see, God creates the world, and then he puts them in a garden to tend and to keep that. And God dwells with humanity in that garden. He walks with them. But then, going forward in God's word, we see that once every 7 years, the Israelites were commanded to give a Sabbath, a time of rest, to the land. What that meant was they were not to work that land anymore. They were to leave the ground without planting for a whole year. Now, doesn't that sound scary? The idea of not planting any crops for a year? Can you imagine that? Well, for one, scientists have found that it's actually good for the land to do things like this, to rest, to not be constantly just making that land work. Same with your animals, Everything needs rest. The land needs rest. But on number 2, the cool thing about the Sabbath year in Leviticus 25 was that God promised he would bring in over double in year 6 if they would obey the 7th. Okay? So you would plant for 6 years, and on that 6th year, not only would God miraculously bring in double the amount of crops, he would bring in even more than double the amount of crops. Just to show you, good job at trusting me. Thank you for believing that I bless if you obey my way. And so this just shows us something about if we could have the understanding that rest is something God gives to us. It's not something we must do, that it makes a drudgery on our lives, but rest is something God graciously gives to us. He's, in a sense, promising, I will make you even more efficient than if you don't rest. You will get more work done resting than not resting. I tell you, folks, I live by that principle. There's a certain time of night where it's like, okay, I'm getting nothing done. In fact, the other day I had an assignment due for school, and it was Sunday, so I worked on it a bit, but after Sunday my brain was fried anyway. So I just turned it in and said, look, my brain is fried, I'm done. And turned it into my professor. It wasn't graded anyway, so that's why I was so bold to do that. But there are times I just hit a wall and I realize I'm done. But if I take the rest God gives to me, I will be better afterwards than if I just continually work through. So every 7 years, Israel was not to plant or harvest in their land. Then, every 7th year, there is this time of Jubilee. So every 50 years, they would let everyone free. Anyone who had been a slave. And back then, you became enslaved to someone if you owned debt. It wasn't the kind of slavery where we steal people and sell them over here. It was the slavery of, I owe you way more than I can pay you, so I am now your servant, your slave, until I work off my debt. In the meantime, I'll also work to help my family, but I will work off my debt. Well, God had it be that every 50 years, every slave was set free. Okay? So if someone is in debt to you in year 48, and you look at him and think, no, I'm not going to make you my slave because I know I'll just lose you 2 years from now. God warns about that in his word and says, you don't allow that to happen. If someone owes you 10 years of work and you hire him 2 years before Jubilee, you still set him free. Okay? You set him free no matter what on this 50th year. And again, God promised that they would find joy and fulfillment if they did that. So 7 is there to establish pattern, rhythm, and a rhythm of rest in life, and to show time moves forward. So the point of all these 7s that Moses incorporates is to draw attention to the 7th day. So what does that mean about rest? How do we apply it to rest? And we've talked about this a little bit throughout. God gives us rhythms of work and rest. Now, that means work, right? So this doesn't allow for laziness. You don't rest first. Don't get up in the morning and rest and take your break and then start your work. Get up in the morning ready to serve the Lord with your work. But God gives rhythms of work, rest, work, rest, work, rest. The more we align ourselves with the rhythms that God gives, the more refreshed we will be. So God gives these patterns of 7 to just incorporate into our lives. And just think of the idea of 7 days a week, the joy that would bring to a group of slaves coming out of Egypt in 1440 BC, because that's who the book of Genesis was written to. It was written to slaves of the nation of Egypt, the people of Israel. And God says, guess what? You're still going to work. It's not vacation the rest of your life, but you're going to have these rhythms, these periods of refreshment where I bless you, you stop working, and you trust me that you will still get done whatever you need to get done as long as you give me a day where you do nothing but rest in the hope that I give you. You think about me. But what this also shows us, it's not that time is just a cycle that moves 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then again 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's not a rat race. It's not a hamster on a hamster wheel. There's actually linear progression. The difference between a line and a circle, right? A line is moving forward, which means there is an end. So the time is moving forward. Here's why this is significant. This is different from every other religion in the ancient Near Eastern world and even the modern Eastern world. The idea now of karma, where you live a good life, you're resurrected to something better. You live a bad life, you're resurrected to something worse. And you just keep living this endless cycle, right? Within Babylonian and other ancient Near Eastern cultures, they saw the seasons every year, and they had what was called the Baal. You've heard the god of Baal, the Baal cycle, and it happened every year. So history was not moving forward, it was moving in a circle. And they'd mark those times a year, but it just moved in a circle. Judaism introduces to the world a concept of moving forward. So within rest, also understand there's days of the week with an end at the 7th day. God is moving us toward an ultimate rest, a ceasing of our labors. All right, this next section, Tale of Two Lamechs. I probably could have ended here, but let's dive into Genesis 4. And you know those lists of names that you sometimes can't pronounce and find boring? Let's look at that right now, okay? Genesis 4:20, starting verse 16, it gives all these, begats. Remember, that's the King James word. So-and-so begat this guy, and then they begat. Methuselah, Lamech, all these guys have kids, and it lists these names. Well, sometimes it will break into that pattern and share with you a little story, a little snippet of what's going on. So this is the line of Cain, Cain's children, his descendants. And what you find within this line is this guy named Lamech, down in verse 23. And what happened was someone tried to attack Lamech, because Lamech says this. Then Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, listen to my speech. For I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. Now, key in on this. If Cain shall be avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. Do you remember anything about Cain and what went on in his life? Well, he killed his brother Abel. And what did God pronounce on Cain at that time? A curse. God pronounced a curse. Cain said, "This is too much, I can't bear it." So then what does God do? He gives a provision in the curse. That provision was, if anyone seeks to kill you, I'll put a sign on you. Right? And if anyone kills you, I will avenge you sevenfold. Right? Lamech looks at this and says, someone tried to kill me. And if God promises Cain sevenfold vengeance if someone tries to kill him, I'm taking vengeance myself. I'm going to avenge it 77-fold. So Lamech is saying, I don't care about God's provision within the curse. I am taking matters into my own hands. Right? So that's a story of one Lamech. If you bounce over to Genesis chapter 5, now we have this line of Seth. But within the line of Seth, we have another guy named Lamech. Lamech was basically like Fred back then. You know, a lot of people had the name. Verse 28. This is a new Lamech. This is from another line. Verse 28. Lamech lived 182 years, and he had a son. He called his name Noah, saying, "This one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord has cursed." So this Lamech has a son, and he names him something. And he says, I'm naming him this because there is another curse that went on, and that's the curse of the ground. God has cursed the ground, and it's toilsome. And hopefully this one will save us from this curse. And in a sense, God uses Noah to kind of recreate the heavens and the earth through the flood. But this Lamech, in naming Noah, gives him this name, Noah. Okay, in Hebrew, it's Noah. You know, it has that harsh ending there. And that name is the Hebrew word for, get this, rest. Okay. So one Lamech rejects, says that the curse of Cain, I don't care about it. I don't care about God's provision. I'm going to take vengeance myself. The next Lamech says the curse of the Lord on the ground is toilsome, so I'm naming my son Noah, rest. Okay. Now this is a different word, obviously, from Sabbath, but it is the word rest that we will find in the book of Exodus, actually. Okay, when God says that you must rest on the Sabbath, God says, in a sense, you must Noah. Okay, you must rest on that day. I got some spit on my Bible here from pronouncing that. Okay, so here's why we have two Lamechs here, and they're emphasizing the rest that God gives. Because, so that's the first thing. Genesis 4, Genesis 5, both of these are Lamechs wrestling with curses. And stories use parallelism so you understand how to read them. So God clues you in with the first Lamech and says, okay, here's the main points I want you to think about. Think about curse. Think about relief from the curse. How are you going to find that? So you think that as you read that Lamech, the next time, a chapter later, you come to another Lamech, you're remembering, okay, curse, relief from curse. And you see that Lamech talks about the curse of the ground, and he brings up the relief that comes from the curse of the ground. And that is the rest that God commands you to take. So in order to escape the curse of the toil of work, rest is what God has graciously provided. And the neat thing is, God provided rest before the ground was even cursed in the first place. That's how gracious our God is. And we find later in the Bible that our salvation was planned before the foundation of the world. Okay? The Lamb of God was slain before the foundation of the world, it says in the book of Revelation. So that means God planned salvation before we had even fallen and sinned against him. That's how gracious God is. That's how mind-blowing his ability with time and omniscience and omnipotence is. I can't figure it all out. But God plans this gracious relief before we even sin. Okay. So humanity rebels, doesn't obey the rest, so God gives a command, and we talked about, I keep not keeping up with my notes. Noah means rest in Hebrew. And when we get to the Ten Commandments, and it talks about this idea of Sabbath day rest, God commands that a Sabbath day be observed. So this shows the Sabbath is about ceasing and about rest. So you cease from the work you do, and then you fill it with the holiness of who God is. That's what God is encouraging us to do. That if you take time out of your schedule to cease from what your vocation is, what your calling is, if you take time to stop that and to just enjoy me, put the work down, close the laptop, put the tools up, cut your phone off, do whatever it takes, and take time to enjoy me, you will be blessed with productivity beyond what you can imagine. That's what God is encouraging us. So to apply this to our lives, I just have a series of questions that I want to ask ourselves. Do we think the world won't function if we're not working? The sad thing is when you leave a job and you find out that the place thrives without you there, right? I worked at Camp Bayuca with Suzanne. That's where I met her in the first place. And I remember we had a mutual friend who worked in the kitchen with her, Evan. And was it just a day you were going to be gone? And our little joke was she just had this whole list of things he had to do. And of course the kitchen was going to fall apart without her there. But after the list, it's in the walk-in. And it'd say something else. It's in the walk-in. So we just kept that joke going. It's in the walk-in, right? Everything was in the walk-in. And lo and behold, Evan was able to handle the work without Suzanne there. It makes you kind of sad sometimes, right? Sometimes you just hope that the place falls apart when you're gone because it needs you. But know and understand the world won't fall apart if you stop working and trust the Lord and give Him some time of undivided attention. See, I'm not saying, by last week you should understand, working is giving time to the Lord. I'm not saying if you dig a ditch you're not giving your time to the Lord. But God is saying, will you trust me to put the shovel down and give me undivided attention, and that you will still be productive in digging that ditch. That's what God is saying here. So, this is a pointed question for all of us. Do we think the world won't function if we're not working? Think about that. Do we take time to cease, rest, and fill that with God's presence? See, it's not just about resting and doing whatever I want. It's not just about counting seashells by the seashore. That's John Piper has this famous sermon about don't waste your life. Don't retire and collect seashells and not go to church, because you're owed retirement. I have no problem with retirement. That's fine. But the idea of our work being done, that's never done. Our work is never done until the Lord takes us home. I know my mom talked about she had raised all three of us, and we were all three out of the home. And she was like, oh, phew. And then she said, oh no. Now they're all getting married, starting families. So now, my relationships have multiplied. My worries now, I have more people to worry about. I have daughters-in-law, because that's all you get with belts is sons. So I have daughters-in-law, and I have grandsons, and a couple of granddaughters to worry about now, where it used to just be 3 of these brats, and now there's tons of them, the work doesn't cease. Right? So fill it with God's presence. Now, do we submit to the rhythms of time that God has given to bless us? And I would encourage you, we're not under law to do this. For Jesus Christ is our Sabbath, and Paul tells us in Colossians 2 to not judge each other on new moons and Sabbaths. So we don't believe under the New Testament that you must observe these days. So I'm not commanding you that you must take a Sabbath, that you must take Saturday. Nor am I even saying that Sunday is the Sabbath. There are those churches that say that. I don't believe that the Bible makes a clear case for that. Now, it certainly makes sense to cease from work on the day you go to church, except our culture's built around that. Do you realize the first people that started meeting on Sunday, that would have been a work day? Do you realize that? Because those are Jewish people. They were meeting on Sunday because the resurrected Lord, but Sunday was a work day for them. Okay? So that's why I don't believe Sunday is equal to the Sabbath. You can make the Sunday a Sabbath, but I believe in your life you just need to seek out the blessing of Sabbath, not have the law of Sabbath on your mind. And do we understand time is moving forward, not endlessly cycling? That there is a rest that you and me are invited to. That rest is the rest that Jesus Christ did the work on the cross for your sins and for mine. And I don't have to work to earn favor with God. Jesus did it for me. And if I would believe that work, my work has ended. And one day my work on this earth will be done, and I will live with him forever in heaven. That's what we are moving history forward to. It's not an endless cycle of work, rest, work, rest, work, rest, work. It is rest coming in the future with Jesus Christ. So let that encourage you. But until that time, let's work while our Master is not here yet. But take those rests that God has provided for you. I would say do at least 1 in 7. 1 in 7 you need to give a day where you cease from that working that you're doing. Let's pray. Our Father, I thank you for the blessing of rest that you give us, Father. And I pray that we express this in a way that will bring the greatest obedience so that we can enjoy the fullest life for your glory. In Jesus' name.